She also a little blooper. Once you kind of read, like, now I'm pretty beagles all the way down. I don't have to show up my hair. Okay.
Okay.
No, I'm sure.
Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our October Corner Society lecture. Thank you so much for being here tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christy Slobogan, and I'm an assistant professor of health humanities and bioethics at the University of Rochester. And as usual, as I do every Corner Society, I'd like to give a little bit of a background on the Corner Society as a whole. Dr. George Washington Corner was the first professor of anatomy at the University of Rochester Medical School. And in 1934, he organized a medical history club to provide opportunities for students and faculty to attend lectures and enjoy lively discussions on all manner of topics within the history of medicine. And so today, the Corner Society continues this tradition of bringing stimulating speakers on diverse topics within the history of medicine to Rochester's physicians, students, scholars, and community members. So thank you all for being a part of that long history. I'm grateful that these events can continue to take place thanks to the generosity of the Department of Health Humanities and Bioethics and the Paul M. Shivey Center for Bioethics. I must also, of course, thank all of the dues-paying Corner Society members, as well as those who have donated to the society in the past. And if you are, of course, interested in becoming an official member or donating, please let me know. I'm always happy to have those conversations. And you can also scan the QR code there if you're interested in being put on the mailing list if you're not on it already, or if you would like to donate to the Corner Society. I would also like to specifically thank Bob Riley and Larry Guttmacher for their continued support of the Corner Society. And I also would like to thank Sue Layton for coordinating everything here at the Rochester Academy of Medicine. For those of you who haven't been to one of these events before, and I see a couple of new faces, they're always here at the Rochester Academy of Medicine on Wednesday evenings at 5:30 with a reception following after. We're keeping to a schedule of 3 talks per semester, per academic semester, and the next one is taking place on November 19th, which you can see on the slide there, where we have the great fortune of hearing the esteemed historian of medicine, Mary Fussell, give a talk that's co-sponsored with RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, titled Savin, Sex, and Scandal, Rethinking Abortion in Early Modern Anglo-America. So I hope to see some of you there as well. And now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Tonight, we hear from Dr. Courtney Thompson, who is an associate professor in the history department at Mississippi State University, where she also chairs the medical humanities minor program. She is a historian of 19th century science and medicine, with research interests in the history of gender and the history of emotions, as well as ethics and historical methodology. Dr. Thompson's first book is titled An Organ of Murder, Crime, Violence, and Phrenology in 19th Century America, from Rutgers University Press, published in 2021. Her most recent publication, co-edited with Dr. Carly M. Smith, is titled Do Less Harm, Ethical Questions for Health Historians. And I would like to say, for those interested in that topic on the ethics of health history, Dr. Thompson is also giving a talk tomorrow at the University of Rochester Medical Center as part of our Health Humanities and Bioethics Grand Rounds. And that talk is titled Becoming an Ethical Historian, Lessons from and for the History of Medicine. So I hope that some of you will be able to make it to that as well. If you need more information about tomorrow's talk, I did bring some flyers that are out on that table out there, and you can also ask me for more information. Tonight's talk draws from Dr. Thompson's current book project, focusing on the influence of identity and emotion on the doctor-patient relationship in 19th century America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Courtney Thompson.
You'll just give me a second. I want to put a clock on because I do have a tendency to talk too much, as those who know me know very well. So thank you very much, Christy, for that kind introduction and for the invitation. It is such a pleasure to be here today at the George Washington Corner Society at the Rochester Academy of Medicine, sharing my work with you. Now, my talk today is a taste of a much larger book project in which I bring together The History of Emotions and Medical Identity in Late 19th Century America. The book is centered around the archive of a little-known 19th century physician, Andrew Bowles Holder, who I use as a lens to explore these themes. His archive allows the historian to glimpse the dailiness of rural medical practice, as well as how his emotional responses to his patients were shaped by patient identities. I contextualize Holder's narrative with respect to the lives of contemporaneous physicians who studied, lived, and worked in similar contexts as they appear in medical records, diaries, letters, and other archival sources. From these sources, I reconstruct the emotional texture of the medical encounter as it was shaped by the embodied identity of the clinician. Doctors' identities were shaped by their gender, ethnicity, class, and regional identity, as well as their personal politics, which in turn affected how they treated their patients, both literally and figuratively. Their diaries, letters, casebooks, and other archival materials reveal precisely how physicians' emotional responses to their patients and their broader theories about health, disease, the body, race, and sexuality resulted from their own development as medical authorities and from their identities and backgrounds. So in particular, my project is invested in untangling the titular calculus of compassion, the affective contours of the doctor-patient relationship. By framing this historical dynamic as a calculus of compassion, I intend to encompass not simply the feeling of compassion itself, but also the process through which the physician was or was not able to empathize with his patients, as well as the degree and nature of his or her feelings, whether expressed explicitly or repressed. This calculus thus indicates the often unconscious emotional reactions of physicians to medical encounters as they were shaped by other factors, especially identity. And I refer not only to pain and suffering here, but also to other emotions that might be reflected back from and experienced with the patient. And the flip side of this calculus, the lack of shared feeling, the inability to emotionally identify and feel with the patient, is equally important to my analysis, resulting, for example, in feelings like disgust, anger, or indifference to others' suffering. I use this phrase thus to indicate the relative emotional distance and ability to reflect or empathize experienced by the regular physician when interacting with his or her patients. This research is also suggestive of how emotional dynamics between doctor and patient continue to shape healthcare experiences and outcomes, especially among minoritized patient populations. So today I'm going to be focusing on my main historical actor, Holder himself, exploring how race and gender in particular shaped his emotional reactions to his patients through a series of key case studies. So first, a brief biography. Andrew Bowles Holder lived a short but eventful life. He was born in 1860 in Lafayette County, a year that is in Mississippi, a year before the outbreak of the American Civil War, in which his father, W.D. Holder, served as a colonel in the Confederate Army. As a young man, he studied literature at the University of Mississippi before becoming enamored of medicine. In 1882, he traveled to St. Louis, Missouri, where he enrolled in what was then the Missouri Medical College. Like many aspirants to the medical profession in the 19th century, after a mere 3-month course of lectures in the medical college, he returned to Mississippi to apply for a medical license. While this may seem strange to us today in the 19th century, such a short course of lessons often sufficed for a medical student to become a physician. In March 1883, at the age of 22, and only 6 months after first beginning his medical studies, he sat his licensing exam in Oxford and received his license to practice medicine. Days later, he moved to Paris, Mississippi to begin his first private practice. And at the end of the month, he wrote his first case into his casebook. For the next 3 years, Holder practiced medicine across the northern and western counties of Mississippi. But in 1886, he evidently decided his short time in medical school wasn't enough, and he went to New Orleans to continue his studies in medicine at Tulane, where he earned his medical degree. After another year of practice in Mississippi, this time further south in Pickens, in 1887, his father, by then the state auditor, helped him to secure a very different job as physician to the Crow Agency in Montana. Now, I don't have time to discuss this very interesting chapter in Holder's life today, but I would be very happy to answer questions about it in the Q&A. After 2 years in Montana, in July of 1889, Holder tendered his resignation, citing a desire to return to private practice. He first went to the Northeast and took on a tour of hospitals in Philadelphia and New York, and he then returned to the South, settling in Memphis. In the city, in addition to private practice, he also worked at the Memphis Hospital and Medical College as a professor of medicine and a surgeon. While in Memphis, Holder still kept his casebook, but he was also busy with other projects, publishing essays on surgery and medicine, as well as on indigenous health and sexuality. But all of this came to an end quite suddenly in 1896, when Holder passed away at just 36 years of age of acute appendicitis. Holder's biography, like his life, is brief here. It doesn't illuminate the experiences of his life. So what exactly is it that makes him useful as a historical actor and as an object of study? In some ways, Holder was unusual, to be sure. His peripatetic career, for example, allows the historian to address understudied parts of the history of medicine, especially late 19th century practice in the rural South and on Western reservations. His casebook was also unusual. The expressiveness of his prose in his manuscript and in his published writings allow for an unusual window into his emotional experience as a physician. Yet Holder was also in many ways very representative of a wide swath of non-elite physicians operating as general practitioners across the country in the last decades of the 19th century. As such, he can provide a window into general practice in this period and stand in for the regular physician as a type. So today I want to highlight Holder's casebook, which is at once a typical document and a quite unusual one due to the florid nature of Holder's writing. What I've learned through close reading of Holder's casebook is that it offered an opportunity to examine an understudied aspect of the history of medicine, and that is its intersection with the history of emotions. That is Holder's unusual and characteristic expressiveness as a writer, which I found immediately striking when I first encountered the casebook, having seen many other such documents from this period, meant that he used his medical text not only to record the details of his cases, diagnosis, treatment, outcome, and so forth, but also to express his emotional response to his patients and to their suffering. What is unique about him and his casebook was his introspective approach to medical record keeping, which included long musings about the pain his patients and their families experienced, as well as hints as to his own sentiments. And further, what is most intriguing to me is how different kinds of patients merited more attention to their grief or sorrow or other emotions felt by both patient and practitioner. And as I read more closely, I realized that the story was not just one about emotions writ large, but more specifically about how Holder's emotions were shaped by his patients' identities, their race, class, and their gender, as I shall explore further in my talk today. I'm going to offer a few case studies of how I am analyzing the interplay of emotion and identity in these archival materials to give you a sense of my own developing approach to doing the history of medicine in emotion in medicine. So let's start with one of Holder's very first patients, Alice Hamblett. Alice Hamblett was a long-term patient of Holder's. He first encountered her in July of 1883, just months after he began his medical practice. At the time, she was 17 years of age, and the young physician was just 22. Alice was an invalid with an ever-changing list of complaints. In their first meeting, she reported a history of partial paralysis of her limbs, attended by, quote, considerable pain and redness and swelling in a 2-week-long attack, followed by a slow but incomplete recovery. A second attack added hyperesthesia to these symptoms. These spells were seemingly related to the irregularity of her menses, and Holder initially diagnosed her with dysmenorrhea and hysteroneurosis, not uncommon given the health challenges she was facing. Over the next 2 years, Holder visited Alice frequently to check her response to his therapies and tracked the ups and downs of her progress. Her health often changed rapidly. On March 30th, 1885, for example, he noted that she was, quote, generally improved and able to visit away from home. But just days later, on April 2nd, he reported that, quote, pain in chest frequent. I very much fear an end in phthisis, or tuberculosis. Holder's concerns about her health status transformed at this point to a fear of her impending death. In September of 1885, Alice took a turn for the worse. She had traveled 9 miles out of town to attend a Baptist Association meeting. She was from a very religious family. But while there, she became ill and was brought home. Holder went to see her immediately, reporting that, quote, I found her sitting propped in a chair, very feeble, coughing badly, with feeble and labored breathing. The next day he returned, and she was, quote, feebler than yesterday. And then she began a rapid decline. Holder narrated the last night and morning of Alice's life from his place at her bedside, including a long moment-by-moment account of her suffering and death. Placing finger on wrist, I found pulse almost gone. In a few minutes, it ceased there. She complained a little of breathing being hard, asked why her hands were so cold. She was dying. The family perceived it. She herself knew it very soon. She now suffered no pain, complained of feeling a little uncomfortable, was perfectly calm and rational, and so remained to 10 minutes before her death. Presently, breathing became irregular and gasping. Eyes rolled back, muscles twitched. She extended her hands and grasped at the air, upper lip drawn up, features pinched. Then, face became natural again. Her eyes gazed forward and upward, and breathing ceased. Heart beat a few times, more feebly, and stopped. At 15 minutes after 12 noon, September 16th, 1885, she was dead. Now, this is only a short selection from his very long account of Alice's suffering and passing, and it paints a detailed and visceral picture of her death. It is clear that Holder sat by her bedside and tended to her at length as she lay dying, even though there was nothing he could do to save her. Holder's account of Alice's decline suggests the ways in which Holder used the form of the casebook to record and interrogate his emotions, with attention to the emotions of the family and Alice's own state of mind, as well as her suffering in her last minutes. But even if Holder did not express his own emotions in the case overtly in this casebook, other documents in his archive reveal the extent to which Alice's death affected him. Holder recorded his own emotional response to the passing of his patient, penning a short, sorrowful poem in her memory, which he inscribed in the end papers of one of his medical textbooks. Calm as the lull of the night wind, calm as the fall of the dew on the flower, her spirit has stolen away, heavy of this sorrowful world of ours. Life here was a life of pain, with many a trial and trouble and sorrow. At last she has fallen asleep, to awake in a heavenly, joyous tomorrow. Now, while the verse is not strikingly original, the poem nevertheless illustrates Holder's emotional response to the passing of his patient, sympathy for her suffering during her short life, and a religiously inflected hope for her to find joy and peace in life beyond death. The poem is also explicitly an expression of his own grief or regret, demonstrating the extent to which her death affected him, as it prompted him to write this poem. And you can see him drafting it. He crossed out and is sort of editing as he goes. A very unusual and perhaps unique response to any of his patients' deaths. If the sentiment was repressed from the casebook, it nevertheless found an explicit expression in his other papers. The long therapeutic relationship between Alice and Holder surely shaped the intensity of his response to her death. The length of his notes in his casebook alone, roughly 8 pages on her case, a record, I believe, suggests his investment. In comparison, in his very first case as a physician, in which his patient, Frank Bowles, also died, Holder only noted tersely, quote, "grew continually worse, and not many days from last note, which was the last date at which I saw him, he died." Holder was not present at Frank's bedside when he passed, which partly explains why his death was not narrated with the same level of detail. Holder's long years of treating Alice also likely affected his emotional response, and he might have been further influenced by their closeness in age and social status. Holder was only 24 when 19-year-old Alice Hamblett died, whom he then had been treating for 2 years. They were close in age, close in social status, and had a very similar family background. Both of their fathers had been wealthy planters who enslaved people before the Civil War, who both served in the Civil War and then lost much of their wealth during the wealth crash post-emancipation. His diaries from his school years likewise reveal Holder's many flirtatious relationships with female associates and family friends, including a list that he kept in the back of one of his diaries of his engagements with women in his social circle. So it might be that he carried some very complicated feelings for this young woman, who under different circumstances might have been a potential romantic partner rather than a patient. But what else separated Frank from Alice? Like many of Holder's other early death cases, including a mother who died with her stillborn child, Frank was Black and Alice was white. Holder here was perhaps demonstrating deep-seated racial bias in his post-Reconstruction Southern context, more capable of seeing his white patients as people and finding compassion for their conditions. And I'll mention here that Holder writes extensively elsewhere. His theories about race, writing about both Black and Indigenous health and identity in some very dehumanizing ways. He also expresses in his diaries a lot of political beliefs, including a wish to return to slavery. He was a supporter of the lost cause. I think this matters. Now, this is all despite of, or perhaps because of the fact that Holder might have known Frank quite well indeed. Frank's last name, Bowles, was the same as Holder's middle name, which had been his mother's maiden name. Frank lived in Lafayette County, which is where Holder's grandmother, Mary Bowles, had enslaved 76 people before the Civil War, a major slaveholder in the region. Given that some of the nameless individuals listed in the 1860 slave schedule have a similar profile to Frank, it is possible that Frank had been formerly enslaved by Holder's own grandmother, and that this is the origin of his last name, which is not uncommon among emancipated individuals. Could Holder have known Frank before treating him? It's hard to say, but it is suggestive that Holder's very first patient bore this possible relation to and shared a name with him. Perhaps Holder's family, his grandmother, coerced or otherwise encouraged their formerly enslaved sharecropping tenants to become clients of the newly credentialed physician, as most of Holder's earliest patients were Black sharecroppers in Paris, Mississippi. Holder's lack of emotional response to these patients then becomes particularly striking in Frank's case, underlining the extent to which racial identity allowed for distance and imperturbability in the face of death and suffering. Race alone, however, does not account for all of the differences in Holder's compassion in his encounters with his suffering patients. Equally revealing are those cases where child patients died or came close to death. And here, a gendered pattern emerged in which female children prompted more sympathy and attention than male children. In September of 1883, Holder was called to the bedside of 11-year-old girl, Minnie Babb, who was diagnosed with malarial fever. Holder recorded a moment-by-moment account of her suffering, growing so concerned that he actually tried to consult with another physician, Dr. Johnson, who was usually his competitor. As with Alice, he sat by her bedside until the early hours of the morning. And as with Alice, his poetic side emerged in his notes for this case, which he evocatively described. And this is right in the middle of the case book itself, which is very unusual for the 19th century to have this kind of commentary. It was the period called by the common people the leaving of the fever, and very properly. Then the excitement and stimulus of the fever is removed, and prostration, sometimes fatal, follows. They consider it critical. It is the period written of by novelists where after weeks of fever, a turning point, a crisis comes, and for a few awful hours the lovely girl stands with feet on the brink of the fatal river, when life hangs by a thread, as it were. Anxious friends and skilled physicians watch each breath and count each heartbeat. The heart says to itself, shall I stop? Shall I go on? Yes, no, yes, and goes on. The crisis is past. She falls into a deep but healthful sleep. The physician departs to see other patients and returns in the morning. She awakes, is feeble, but the light of reason is in her eyes and the beat of returning health at her heart. She is better. This description suggests the emotional intensity, anxiety, and expectation intertwined of his bedside vigil. Eventually, Minnie improved enough to fall into a natural sleep, and she would recover completely. Yet other patients inspired less compassion than lovely girls like Minnie and Alice. In October 1884, a year after treating Minnie, Holder was called to attend to another child's bedside, in this case, Lee Pruitt, a young white boy diagnosed with diphtheria. In some ways, Holder's account of Lee's illness echoed his description of similar cases, but his account was noticeably shorter and less elaborate in his depiction of the child's suffering. As with Minnie and Alice, Holder believed that Lee was dying. But rather than sit by the bedside through the night, he decided the child was a lost cause. Quote, oops, I went too far, didn't I? Oh no, I'm missing a slide. All right, you're going to have to just hear me say it. Here's the quote. I decided it would soon die. Nothing I had done had seemed to do any good. Told the parents it was probably dying. I did not think it could last long, so I departed, not expecting to return, as I suppose the father would soon follow to get shrouding. So Holder's callous assumption here that the father would soon follow to get shrouding would actually not be borne out. Another physician, Dr. Montgomery, was called and he effected a recovery. And from this case, Holder noted that he had learned an important lesson, quote, never to give up a patient till he dies. Yet his quick giving up, compared with his bated breath at Alice and Minnie's bedside, suggests that other factors affected both his sympathy and his attentiveness. The use of the dispassionate it to refer to the child in the case, while conventional to refer to infants and toddlers at the time, nevertheless seems to suggest the emotional distance he felt. His commentary on the case in his casebook also suggests his own shame at his failings for giving up on his patient, serving as a useful reminder of his own foibles and a clue to the emotional responses hidden in the casebook. So let's turn at this point to one of the most remarkable cases in the casebook, that of 6-year-old Ira Dickey. Holder was called to the Dickey house in the evening of December 26, 1884. Ira had been away for several days visiting her grandmother for Christmas, and, quote, today was brought home, and on the way said to her father, Papa, I'm sick, and lay back in the wagon. After that, she only became more ill, as Holder's detailed account of her sickness, which proved to be cholera, demonstrates. Hold on, there we go. This was the right quote. I'm so annoyed. There, that was the quote that I want to show you. I just missed that first sentence. There we go. All right, here's Ira Dickey. From the beginning, her thirst was inordinate and insatiable. Every 5 minutes, she begged piteously for something to drink and would seize the vessel and drink in gulps all we would allow. And by the time the cup was set aside, would cry for it again, would appeal to each of us in the room in turn to give her something to drink. I can hear her voice in memory when she would be referred to me. Doctor, oh doctor, please, sir, let me have some water. Just one little bit. All the time, she would continually toss herself from under the cover, and when it was replaced, would cry out, Oh, Ma, you will smother me to death. Oh, Ma, if you make me lie under this cover, I'll die. She suffered a good deal, almost continually throwing her hands about and above her head, mourning and sobbing in her sleep. In his close narration of her illness, Holder captured the pain and suffering of this child, narrating not just symptoms, but also the futility of care and the emotional extremes produced by these circumstances. Ira is literally given a voice as well. She names her illness, she narrates her experience. And Holder's difficulty with treating Ira and his failure to save her perhaps echoed in his own mind. As he wrote, I can hear her voice in memory. This case touched a nerve, and his patient's emotions directed his own emotional engagement. Holder's response to Ira's suffering and those of his other white female patients was likely shaped in part by cultural norms and narratives. The idea of the beautiful, suffering, young female invalid was an important literary and cultural trope of the 19th century, constituting a cult of female frailty, best seen in Holder's devotion to Alice Hamlet. Depictions of suffering and dying children were also widespread in 19th century culture and literature, to the extent that such images constituted a narrative cliché. Holder had a wealth of references to draw upon from sentimental literature in his depictions of childhood suffering and death, and he did keep a list of books, at least that he read as a teenager, so I know some of the sentimental fiction he was reading that he might have been thinking with as he encountered people like Ira and Minnie. So his compassion for Minnie, Ira, and Alice, and for all of his white female patients of all ages may have been shaped in part by the media he consumed and the cultural narratives of the era, as well as by his own regional and racial identity, particularly his self-fashioning as a Southern gentleman and hence protector of delicate Southern white womanhood. But Ira's case wasn't over yet. It had a sequel, which further raised the stakes. At the very same time that Ira was sick in bed, her mother, Ellen, was pregnant and close to term. The stress of caring for Ira caused her to manifest her emotional suffering as physical symptoms. The child was rapidly growing worse, and soon after the mother lay down, had a convulsion, and the mother was greatly affected and would stay up and by the child. There was but one room to the house with beds, and she could not be separated from the child. She was very sure she was in labor. She gave way painfully to her grief and had to be placed in bed by main force. A few moments thereafter, I found she had ceased breathing. Her heart still beat. Her head was low, her face suffused with blood. She is naturally florid. Her lips compressed, her eyes closed. I shook her, compressed her chest at intervals with my hands to secure respiration. In a few moments, the lips opened, and she made a gasp for breath, and with the expiration came the question, "Is she dead?" Then she stopped again, but by shaking and pinching, I kept her breathing for a minute, and then she breathed naturally again. During my attention to her when she did breathe, She was constantly asking me to leave her and see to Ira. Even at the height of her own medical crisis, the mother could only think of her child, and her distress at the possibility of losing her daughter caused her to become ill herself. This case reads as if it were lifted from a novel: the ill child, the prostrate mother, the near-death experience, and the intervention of the able, or perhaps not so able, physician. Ellen's case was pervaded with the language of despair, grief, suffering. She fainted at least 4 more times in Holder's telling, and his casebook reveals his distraction as he moved from one sick bed to the other. Ellen's condition also perplexed him, since her attacks were not true labor pains, nor were they the result of heart failure or lack of blood to the brain. Quote, "It was nervous, but what does that mean?" She complained at the intervals of intense headache and feeling very strange. On each occasion, they came on just after an outburst of grief. Ellen's physical illness was based on her emotional state, in Holder's telling, and he himself evinced anxiety and confusion in treating her. After Ira died, quote, "The mother's grief gradually assuaged, and she became well again." 6 days after her daughter's death, Holder was called to the house again to deliver the mother of a new child. Life and Holder's practice continued. The extremity of Ellen's embodied emotional response to her daughter's suffering and death is perhaps not surprising. What is unusual is that Holder records it in such detail, giving a voice to her emotional expression. Indeed, his retelling of what he witnessed at the bedside was in some ways more extreme and detailed than scenes of similar episodes in sentimental fiction of the period. Holder's casebook provides a window into the emotions engaged at the bedside, both making use of tropes from sentimental fiction and other genres while moving beyond them into the realm of realism by way of eyewitness account. And in so doing, we are able to reconstruct some of the emotions experienced by the physician, the patient, or patients in this case, and the other family members during the medical encounter. Now, to be clear, Holder was not alone in participating in these cultural narratives or in recording the emotional theater of the sick room. Other contemporaneous physicians also reveal similar emotional responses directed by the gender, race, age, and class status of their patients. And my book brings the work of these other physicians into focus as well to explore the shared emotional world of doctor and patient. I have only barely scratched the surface of Holder's archive today, sharing with you some key cases from his casebook that I think bring to life and highlight Holder's compassion or lack thereof, and deep feeling as a physician at the bedside, epitomized best, I think, by this contemporaneous, well-known painting, The Doctor, with which I assume some of you might be familiar, which quite tellingly, I think, Holder kept a copy, which survived in his archive, and the black and white sort of beat up one was his. So where does this all leave us? Why does it matter how one doctor in 19th century Mississippi felt about his patients and whether his emotions and their identities shaped the care with which he provided them? As I said, my goals with my broader research project are to use Holder as just one case study in comparison with those of other contemporaneous physicians for exploring dynamics of compassion and care in medicine at the end of the 19th century by following Holder through the key contexts in which he studied, lived, and worked. I am not, to be clear, trying to make a case for Holder as a new great man. In fact, he was kind of a terrible person in a lot of ways I can get into if anyone wants to ask me about it. But instead, I want to use him as a sort of useful point of view character to reveal that fine texture and especially the emotional valence of the doctor-patient relationship in understudied contexts in this period especially in the rural South and on reservations in the West. In so doing, I hope that Holder's life and work will help me to open a door into the past to consider the dailiness of medical practice in these sites and what it meant, and perhaps more importantly, felt like to be a physician or a patient in history. And I believe that this research can also help us to better understand the history of contemporary medical challenges, particularly those posed by the COVID crisis, which, to be clear, is still ongoing. Other scholars have pointed out, for example, how deeply identity categories, particularly race, age, and disability, have shaped the experiences of patients and their families, as well as their outcomes. Any number of studies have demonstrated that who one is absolutely affects the treatment one receives, the attentiveness of one's practitioners, and even who lives and who dies. But I believe emotion is still a crucial element to this calculus of care and compassion. To paraphrase Lucien Febvre, writing almost a century ago now, without considering emotions, no real history of medicine will be possible. Emotion is crucial to understanding the experience of patients, their families and caregivers, and medical practitioners. And this feels particularly necessary right now, as we have been overwhelmed and eventually have become numb to the sheer volume of sickness and death. In the age of COVID-19, suffering has been reduced to data, losing the human experiential element. As numbers continue to mount in the current pandemic, and as they continue to mount in all of our other major health crises, the mass of the dead and suffering grows ever more abstract, insurmountable. So how can we manage our grief? How can we even imagine our grief? And I think it's only by finding small stories, by shining a spotlight on individual cases and individual faces, banishing the shadow of death, and as crucially, the fog of aggregation. Historians should do this work, providing collective biographies or perhaps obituaries of loss, of suffering, of feeling ill in all its senses, and of caring for those who are ill and dying, to assist in the process of seeing people as they really are. And this is particularly essential when we look at the very recent history of COVID. Many early COVID patients, as we know, died in solitude without witnesses to their suffering. How can we find and construct effective and affective illness narratives when the COVID-19 patient died alone? And how can we understand the emotional toll this takes on their healthcare workers and their caregivers? Attention to the emotional experiences of illness, care, confinement, and death for both patients and for healthcare workers and caregivers can provide us not only with a richer, more textured understanding of medical history, but it can also build a bridge between the past and the present. If emotion is the language of the epidemic, and something much discussed in medical humanities and in healthcare today, it reveals an omission in how we have accounted for experiences of disease and health in the past. Perhaps we can return to a social historical exploration of patient and practitioner experience, infusing it, reinvigorating it with the lessons of the history of emotion. I suggest that we try to empathize with our historical subjects and that we embrace the affective experience of doing and of living history. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Courtney. That was wonderful. We have time for questions. And I ask that folks who have questions use this mic. So I'll be roaming around so that folks on Zoom can hear you. Yeah. Right.
First, thank you so much. This was wonderful. First, a comment, then a question for you. It struck me so much that the state hospital here has records from the same period. If you look at them, you may go a year between notes on a given patient. but the notes are so rich and full of description, you have a feel for the patient that would be altogether missing from the current record. The question, what do you think Holder's intent was in keeping this book? Was it to understand himself and manage his emotion? Was it to monitor the course of a patient? Was it to be read by colleagues? What do you want to accomplish?
Okay, thank you for both the comment and the question. As to the comment, I'm going to have to take a look at those records. They sound great. I'm mostly trying to stick with records of those in private practice because I'm really interested in general practice in this period. Although I am talking a little about hospital experiences in the chapter where I discuss him going to Memphis. What's really interesting is how the emotion just comes out around the edges. Sometimes you get these beautiful textured details like you're discussing. And I've seen these in some hospital case books as well. Sometimes one of my favorites that I found is this ledger from the early 20th century. And ledgers are typically, if you've ever seen a ledger, they're very boring. It's usually just like visit $2 or whatever, like maybe medicine, like it doesn't give you anything. But this guy would write like scrawled notes on top of the ledger over people's names. And my favorite is there's a bunch of people, he would just write deadbeat like on them, which is just, I mean, it's beautiful, right? So what do I think he was doing? Well, this is, I think, where it gets really interesting and where the particularity of who Holder was really matters. I think there's a reason why he was so characteristically expressive. And I think that comes from his teenage years, actually. One of the things that's unique about his archive, and again, another reason that I was so drawn to it, is that I have his college diaries and his case books. So I can paint a picture of him from when he first started keeping a diary, at least the first diary we have, from when he was 16 until his death, right? So he didn't live for a long time, but I have a lot of great detail about his mentality. And as a young man at the age of 16 and 17, medicine was nowhere near, it was not on his mind. I mean, he paid a lot of attention to when the yellow fever epidemic came in 78, because that affected his life and livelihood. But he was the son of former slaveholders. He wrote a lot about the cotton crop. He wrote a lot about Southern politics. And he was a literary dude. His first entries in his first diary are all about how he's trying and failing to get published. It's actually really fascinating. And there's some other examples of his poetry. If anyone wants to check them out, they're great. So I think he comes from this, he's like many other Southern men of his generation. He was taught the classics. He studied Greek and Latin. He read a lot. He kept a list of the books he read. This was how he engaged with the world. And he saw himself as some sort of a literary, potentially figure. That's not how his life worked out. But I think it shapes how he narrates his life. And I also think that, frankly, the inadequacy of his training probably affected that too. He went to a single course of lectures and then set up shop in Paris, Mississippi, which he chose in part because that's where his family's cotton gin was. He knew there was only one other physician in town, and there was this crop of sharecroppers he could use as a perfectly built patient population who wouldn't have a choice but to work with him. But he was never taught to manage his emotions or even how to keep a case book necessarily. So he kind of did what he could. And I think that's why there's these moments where the emotion just sort of drips out of it, or he dives into these sort of literary digressions, because that's how he best knows how to express himself. It's part of how he had always written in notebooks. Now the notebook is a different kind, but he's still using that model. It's also very interesting because he becomes much less candid and florid about his emotions as the years progress. The years where he's just starting out, he's a 22-year-old fresh out of medical school, are where he's the most introspective and where you get these flashes of feeling. And today I mostly talked about grief and sad feelings, but we get jealousy, anger, joy, pride. There's a lot of emotions. But by the time we get to his Memphis years, his records are very short, very to the point. His handwriting also declines. I don't think that he had in mind publication at that point. When he's in Memphis, though, he is publishing. So I think that was shaping the shape of his notes. That was a long answer, but it was a great question. So thank you.
No, that's great. So it answered one of my questions, which was, as I was
reading those quotations, I was like, he's giving like frustrated novelist. And
Yes.
so that really kind of answers.
He was 100%, and he didn't want to be a physician. I want to be clear, there's this phenomenon post-Civil War where men like Holder and his family suffered what's known as a wealth shock. Mississippi was the richest state in the nation up to the Civil War. It had the highest per capita. Natchez, for example, one of the major cities in Mississippi, had the highest per capita number of millionaires in the country. He was rich, and he was from even richer family members. They lost their wealth and their power. And so a lot of what he and other men that I'm writing about are talking about, like he grew up knowing what he lost. And there's this economic anxiety that just runs through everything they're writing. Medicine was like his fourth attempt to make money. And he basically writes in his diary, it's not, he essentially says, like, I'm not particularly into medicine. And if this doesn't work out, I guess I'll be a lawyer or something, but like, I need to make money. The cotton gin isn't work, like this was not his goal in life, but it becomes his career. And that's part of why it's so interesting.
Thank you so much, Courtney. As I was listening to you, I was also like, oh, it's giving frustrated novelist. Like there are multiple ways to interpret these entries, like one of them being, here's this deeply compassionate doctor that is very emotionally invested in his patients and their experiences. Another way to read it is like, here's this incredibly like inward facing, navel gazing, like self-indulgent, quite insufferable man, right? And I think of compassion as like feeling with instead of feeling for, and like it being this deeply like receptive and respectful emotional experience that has both cognitive, affective, and motivational elements. I just was wondering if you could speak to, sorry, it's such a big question, how you're understanding emotion or compassion, and like one way of reading him is it's quite an impotent kind of compassion, right? I just, was wondering if you could speak to like, bring us back to compassion, what sort of true compassion is, and how do we reconcile his emotional, his portrayal of his like emotional experiences in this quite flamboyant way with like, I don't know, authentic compassion or something?
That's a wonderful question. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not writing a biography of Holder, right?
Yeah.
So there's other physicians, some of them I think are more authentically compassionate in the way that you're discussing than he is. One of my favorite cases is there's this physician who was working in Providence, and he writes an account actually in his diary, not in his casebook, which I have all sorts of thoughts about how he separated the sort of two sides of himself. Some stuff made into the casebook, some of it made into the diary, but he's writing at the same time. But no, actually the case I'm thinking of was in the casebook, which is why it was so strange. And he basically is again at the bedside of a young girl who's dying. It's like Alice Hamlet all over again. And he says, he basically narrates, it's like, I started crying and I looked away so they couldn't see it, but I couldn't keep the tears from coming, right? There's this real sort of vulnerability that he's expressing, as well as a real feeling with the patient. The title phrase and the sort of key concept, which I am, the book isn't published yet, so I'm open to suggestions. Is a riff, for those of you who know, on Martin Pernick's concept of his book, Calculus of Suffering, which is about anesthesia and its uses in the 19th century. And a big part of Pernick's work, which is a classic in the field, is about how the decision to use anesthesia wasn't always about medical necessity, right? It had a lot more to do with identity, who the patient was, who the practitioner was. It actually said more about the social world of practitioner and patient and how these intersected. So I am riffing on and building on that, but thinking about treatment rather than literal treatment, metaphorical treatment. I'm very interested in the interpersonal dynamics and how identity shapes them on both ends. And while the title is Calculus of Compassion, I am interpreting this as not just the feeling with, but the lack of ability to feel with, right? So it's a calculus. It's not always complete or possible. And some folks like Holder, they feel a lot of compassion for themselves. Yeah, I mean, it's a really, you mentioned this very inward facing, like one of my favorite examples from him that I don't get to get into, but I have a whole chapter that I'm doing on basically the emotions that happen when there's multiple people in the room, and how things like competitiveness, anger, all this. So Holder gets called to an obstetrical case, and obstetrical cases were highly desirable for all sorts of reasons. For one, it was the most money you could often charge. Usually you charge around $10 for an obstetrical case in the 19th century, as opposed to $1 or $2 for a different kind of doctor's visit. If you got in on an obstetrical case, that also usually meant that you'd keep becoming the physician for the family. So there was a lot of value in becoming in that kind of role. So he gets called to one of his first ever obstetrical cases. And the woman, there's trouble. There's trouble brewing. There's midwives in the room. The midwives are sniping back at him, and he hates them. The mom is like, the mother to be is freaking out. The husband is freaking out. The husband's like, we should call another doctor. And Holder's like, I agreed, mad, but I acquiesced and didn't let them know I was angry. There's this very petty sort of thing. I do think we also have to keep in mind he's like 22 through most of these cases. He's very young, and I think that does come out. But I am still thinking about how do we write, and this is a big question for historians of emotion. How do we historicize emotions themselves? How do we use our language to talk about their feeling, especially when we're only getting it through these glimpses? Our language is necessarily imperfect, but I think it's still worth trying to do. And I'd love to keep having this conversation maybe tomorrow over dinner.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Sarah first.
I had a quick question. There were a couple moments where I saw the word reason appear in some of his notes where a patient is having the light of reason kind of enter her eyes, which I found really striking given how emotional and sentimental the rest of the language was.
Mhm.
I'm curious whether you felt that this was kind of an interesting contradiction in some ways, that, to be experiencing reason was that enlightening force, that I don't know, does he see himself as kind of the primary reasoner? Why is he transposing that onto his patients upon their recovery? I guess it kind of begs the question, did he see himself as objective and his patients as subjective in a way that maybe we think of doctors now? So I'm just kind of curious whether that was also a notion that is, that's maybe a 20th century idea about doctors, or that language of empiricism or enlightenment hadn't quite hit at that point. So
Great questions. I'm sort of going to take this in two directions. So I haven't thought too much about his use of the word reason, but I can tell you that broadly speaking, 18th, 19th century theories of mind and relation between mind and body, reason is one of the code words that you use to refer to the mind part of the mind-body or body-mind dyad, right? So I think it's very much pointing in that direction. I think I'd have to think a little bit more about what he's doing in order to have a good answer for you. However, this question about objectivity and subjectivity, I think, is essential, and it's part of how I am framing the book. If you are familiar with the history of medicine of the 19th century, there's a story that is familiarly told. I have fallen into this trap myself of talking about the last decades of the 19th century as this period that is dominated by scientific medicine, by hospitalization, by the German influence, as well as other, sort of the narrowing of medical sects, all this kinds of stuff. And one thing that I want to pull out in this book is the extent to which older traditions continue a lot longer than we would think. Scientific medicine is not touching these dudes, and it won't. Even though, there are, and that's why I'm trying to focus very purposefully on non-elite physicians, especially in rural spaces, on places like reservations. These are not our city doctors who got to go to Germany and who studied for 4 years at Hopkins. Like, these are guys who went for 3 months of courses and then are starting to stick people with, fill people with drugs. There's a longer, deeper tradition of historical medicine here. And this goes along with our notions about the emotional comportment of the physician, which is a big part of the the overarching narrative of the story. If you look at the works of Benjamin Rush at the beginning of the 19th century, Rush, one of his big parts about the character of the physician is all about sympathy and the emotional comportment. There's a certain way you're supposed to behave as a physician. You're supposed to be a gentleman, but you're also supposed to empathize and to feel with your patients and hold yourself in a particular way. And then William Osler, at the very end of the century, preaches for equanimity, right? Of basically impassivity, not total impassivity, right? Like not completely becoming cold as ice, but by the 80s, he's giving lectures and speeches. This is becoming the new ethos of medicine. Doctors are dispassionate. We're not leaning into sympathy. But that's not the case. Like that's part of the narrative of modernization of medicine in the last decades of the 19th century. But it's just not the case. Like at the very same time that Osler is publishing Equanimitas and giving that as speeches at Hopkins, other medical journals in this country, especially in the South, are preaching compassion and sympathy and still sort of taking that Rushian line about character. So I think what I'm doing is I'm making a case for continuity in the late 19th century with these older models of thinking and being and feeling, or at least, I guess sort of following John Harley Warner, like things take a lot longer to get stamped out than you would think. They were still bloodletting patients in the 1880s. They were also still having deep feelings in the 1880s, despite Osler's call to equanimity. And yeah, so this is part of the big arc of the book. So I'm really glad you asked about that. Thank you.
We've got time for probably one more shortish question before we move this. Paul, I see you.
Yeah, but it's, I mean, we also have some. Okay. I will ask. I'm very curious as to why you chose to use Holder as your example this evening. Everything about him was subjective. His notes are subjective.
Mhm.
So the credibility of those notes are a reflection of his intent. And we're talking about the dubious nature of his intent, his motivations in becoming a doctor, his motivation in his response to his patients. So I'm curious and I know there was a lot of documentation, and also even in your recent comment about the sustaining of an old school approach, he probably didn't know of that necessarily. And I'm assuming that, so I would think that just in your it's very hard to make a conclusion about very much in here because everything is just,
Thank you for your question. I think that's a really interesting one. Well, Daston and Gallison would say that both subjectivity and objectivity are different styles of knowing, and they both have the same goals in mind. And it is actually, this period of the 19th century is the one that is transitioning to the model of knowing that you're thinking of. What I'm interested in is his subjectivity and the subjectivity of the other physicians. I am interested in the emotional responses. Who can say that an emotion is right or wrong, right? I'm interested in the mere existence of these emotions and how they were expressed and what they might tell us about what happens in a room when a doctor and a patient and maybe caregivers are all negotiating that experience together. I don't know about you guys, but when I go to the doctor, I'm first of all the worst patient. I get very nervous. I faint when I get my blood drawn. I'm the worst patient. But there's a lot of emotions, like even in a pretty standard medical encounter. And then we're talking about these moments of extremis. At least to me, from the point of view of me being a patient or seeing family members have medical encounters, I think emotions are really rife and are baked into a lot of our encounters with healthcare. And that is true in history. And ultimately, my big conclusion is that we need to pay attention to it. That's the conclusion. Who's right and who's wrong? I mean, ultimately, it does not actually matter what Alice Hamlet's actual diagnosis was and why she died. What mattered is how she died and how that was experienced by the people in the room as best we can understand it. And there's other things that are worth knowing about Alice Hamlet too, but if you're interested in that, I'll talk about it tomorrow. So.
Okay, great. And we can also continue chatting about all of this in this room over here during reception, but please join me in thanking Courtney Thompson.
Do I need to do anything with? Okay. Great. Thank you, Sue. Thank you for doing all the. Thank you. Thank you for closing it. Okay.